Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our second day of the 3-day third-party risk management bootcamp. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use. If you're not familiar with our webinars or did not join us yesterday, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Ask Question widget. We love getting questions and do capture all of them throughout the session, so we'll be answering some during the live webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to get to, we will address with you via email. In the related content widget, you'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, a link to our library of hundreds of additional resources, and links to several pieces we've selected to draw your immediate attention to. Today's live session is eligible for up to 2 CPE credits, 1 per hour. If you wish to receive these credits, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up link on Friday that will need to be completed in order to receive the CPE credit. We hope you found day 1 of the bootcamp valuable as we briefly covered the third-party risk management lifecycle and its main 3 stages to set the stage for the entire bootcamp. Hillary kicked off our vendor onboarding sessions by speaking to the planning and risk assessment component in more depth. Then we dove into the due diligence process and expectations during vendor onboarding, and Kelly wrapped us up discussing contracting and its importance before partnering with a vendor. Today we're moving on through the third-party risk management lifecycle and focusing on the ongoing stage. We're looking forward to covering even more important third-party risk management topics with you. For the next hour, we will be joined by VinMinder's Lisa May Hill, Director of Information Security Operations, who will talk about reviewing your vendor SOC reports in cybersecurity. At 2 p.m. Eastern Time, VinMinder's Hershey Long, Senior Information Security Specialist, will discuss vendor business continuity management. After that, we'll be joined by VinMinder's CFO, Raman Zachariah, to discuss your vendor's financial health and what to watch for there. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Lisa. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Hello and welcome to session 3. Today we're going to be covering SOC reports and cybersecurity, which are 2 really important areas of information security. We're going to start this session off with some ongoing items, and then we're going to dive deeper into SOC reports, talking about the different types of SOC reports, how vendor SOC reports fit into the process, and when to review them, what to look out for, and what to do on an ongoing basis with SOCs. All right, let's get started. Okay, so yesterday we introduced the third-party risk management lifecycle. So we're going to continue on with this lifecycle today by going through the ongoing portion. This includes things like reassessments, more due diligence, renewals, monitoring, and performance. So for example, reassessments must occur to help continuously monitor information security and determine if further mitigation is needed. You want to determine if the risk to your organization has changed, and if so, exactly how you'll mitigate or reduce that risk by implementing various controls. What we're looking at for here is the ability to prevent and prepare them for impactful events such as phishing attacks and data breaches. Those kinds of things can lead to confidential information leaks. Some ways to do this are by requesting the vendors strengthen their internal controls, test their operating controls more frequently, etc. We're going to dive deeper into all of this now during this session. So yesterday we ended the onboarding process with the contracting stage. Once a contract is signed, you're really still not done, and that really leads us into today. In the regulated environments, it's required to monitor not only the performance, as in are we getting the products and service as expected, but also ongoing risk. Is the quality there? Is it delivered on time? Is it at the right place? At the same time, we're also trying to stay aware to any new risks or emerging risks and validating that risk profile and their rating at regular intervals. So it's important to schedule reviews and monitorings. Ask yourself questions like, is the vendor responsive to email and phone calls? Do you feel your problems or issues are solved within a reasonable time frame? Are your representatives knowledgeable, and are they providing accurate data at the first request? Have they lost any key personnel? Is there any negative news about your vendor? Does the vendor act professionally at all times? It may be useful to have regular meetings with your vendor to address performance issues, any emerging risks or new risks, industry trends, those kind of things. Okay, let's take a quick second just to break this down into 3 buckets. Formal performance and risk monitoring should recur at regular intervals. For your vendors deemed as critical or high risk, this should happen quarterly at a minimum. For moderate risk, 18 to 24 months, and then 2 to 3 years for low risk. The continued due diligence process, or the formal risk review, should be at least annually for critical and high risk. And contract management should be occurring all the time. Anything that needs to be removed, changed, or added should be considered before contract renewal happens. When we refer to due diligence, just keep in mind that some organizations refer to this as ongoing risk management. But regardless, you're going to want to have a formal schedule where the same rigorous evaluation of the control environment is assessed. First, you want to make sure that things like insurance certificates reflect the right types of insurance, usually general liability or separate cyber liability coverage. You'll likely have some of these documents already. Are they the most current ones? Are any of the third-party audits expired? If so, is there a bridge or a gap letter provided? And then how's their financial health looking? Changes, either positive or negative from the previous year, should be identified and called out. And we're going to look at these all more in the coming slides, but things like SOC reports, cybersecurity policies, business continuity and disaster recovery, all of those things should be thoroughly examined and be tested. What are the results? Are there improvements that are needed? Are there exceptions? Finally, ensure that all licenses are current and appropriate, and that compliance policies and trainings are all current and up to date as well. Okay, so let's jump into SOC reports. SOC reports provide further intel into a vendor's information security posture. As I've mentioned before, there are different types of SOC reports, and we're going to look at each of them a little bit more in depth. There's a SOC 1, a SOC 2, which can come in either a SOC 1 or a SOC 2. And then SOC 2s, now there's a SOC 2 Plus, and then a SOC 3, and then finally SOCs for cybersecurity. First, let's look at the 2 most common types of SOC reports, a SOC 1 and a SOC 2. SOC 1 reports are really intended to be used to validate and verify that internal controls over financially reporting are sufficiently in place at the vendor for your use. You would want to review a SOC 1 when you're primarily concerned about the impact of financial reporting specifically. These SOCs are generally meant for auditor use and compliance purposes. A SOC 2 report is going to help you measure how the vendor provides their product or service under the umbrella of specific trust service criteria. These criteria are security, availability, confidentiality, privacy, and processing integrity. A SOC 2 is not necessarily going to cover all of the trust service criteria, as vendors can pick and choose which criteria to be audited on. However, the audience for a SOC 2 is going to be wider than a SOC 1. Most of the time, a SOC 2 is probably the report you really want. It's most definitely the report you want from an IT vendor. A SOC 2 is the only audit and report that defines a consistent set of criteria specifically around products and services that a company provides to you. And if you want to measure how your vendor provides a secure, available, confidential, and private solution, then the SOC 2 is the way to go. And if you have the choice between picking from a SOC 1 and a SOC 2, always go with the SOC 2. So when we talk about SOC 1 and SOC 2s, we really need to talk about the different types that they can come in. Each SOC can be done as a type 1, which covers a point in time, or a type 2, which is going to be covering a period of time, typically 6 to 12 months, though we are seeing more at 3 months. Type 1s are only a point in time, generally. You're not able to determine the operating effectiveness of controls, only the design and implementation of them, where a SOC 2 is going to give you both. The examples shown here show the first paragraph in the auditor's report. This is just templated language found in the SOC report showing an as-of date for a Type 1 and a date range for a Type 2. Another option you might see with the SOC 2 is it being combined with other control frameworks, such as the Cloud Security Alliance's Cloud Controls Matrix or HITRUST. These are called SOC 2 pluses. They've been around for a while, but are now becoming more and more common. A SOC 2 plus has come up kind of with large-scale vendors that cross industries. And so they're really taking advantage of the fact that you can combine the trust service criteria with another audit framework, creating a more valuable and robust report, and kind of gating audit efficiencies by testing like-mapped controls all in one setting. We get asked a lot about the value of a SOC 3. SOC 3s are good for early vetting during the vendor selection process. It's essentially a summary of a SOC 2 that comes with a seal of approval. One advantage of the SOC 3 is that it can be publicly shared without an NDA. However, you should never be using a SOC 3 as your only form of due diligence. It's not comprehensive. It's designed to be made available publicly, and it's less technical with fewer details. You're not going to get that same testing and control evidence that you would see in a SOC 2. So SOC for cybersecurity are kind of gaining momentum. This report's goal is to provide an extra level of trust and confidence surrounding a vendor's cybersecurity risk management program. 3 of the 5 trust service criteria you're going to recognize from the SOC 2 are used: security, availability, and confidentiality. We've seen a handful of these come across lately, and I think they may be picking up a little bit more steam. But speaking with auditors who lead SOC engagements, there's still a slow adoption of them. But good to understand them and know that they're out there. Before we move on, I just wanted to include a quick slide that summarizes the various types of SOC reports that you may come across, with SOC 1s and SOC 2s being the most common. SOC 2 pluses and SOC for cybersecurity kind of picking up speed lately. And then, of course, the SOC 3, which is a summary of a SOC 2 and shouldn't be used as your only form of due diligence, but does come up pretty often in that initial vendor vetting phase. Okay, so now that we have the various types of SOC reports down, here's a little visual comparison of a SOC 1 and a SOC 2 table of contents. Different audit firms will lay out the contents of each section a little bit differently, but the 5 main sections are going to remain similar. Each of these shows the 4 sections, with section 5 being optional, which is why it's not on either table of contents. But we're going to go through each section for each of these reports together. Okay, so continuing on with that anatomy of the SOC report, the first 3 sections the first 4 sections are consistent in either a SOC 1 or a SOC 2. Section 1 is going to be the auditor's report. Here you're going to find key information such as who the audit firm is, whether it's a carve-out or inclusive report, the scope, and of course the auditor's opinion. We're going to talk about some of these things more in depth in a few minutes. Section 2 is generally the organization's management assertion. This section essentially says that the organization has worked with the auditors in good faith, lays out any information they feel is important to include. And then section 3 is the description of the system. This is the narrative of the report, kind of the bulk of the reading. Here you're going to find the organization's representation of the in-scope system. It's going to address many topics, including risk management, an overview of the organization's operations, and information about each control objective. Sometimes audit firms will even put the complementary user entity controls here as well. So section 4 is the actual layout of the control objectives and activities along with testing and results of testing. Section 5 is that optional section that I talked about a couple slides back that wasn't in our table of contents. And section 5 is an area where you'll see unaudited information that could assist in the understanding of the control environment. So some common contents of this section are business continuity and disaster recovery information, as well as management's response to exceptions is often found here. Okay, we're going to keep moving on to look at some more key components of SOC reports that you should review, but first we have our first polling question of the hour for you.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. Please remember, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This first question is, how valuable are SOC reports to your third-party risk management program? A key component, nice to have, you're indifferent, we don't ask for SOC reports, or you're not sure. Lisa, we have some time right now to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience. And that question is, what is better, a SOC 1 or a SOC 2?
This is a really great question, and really it's one we get all the time. The short answer is that it really depends on what you're using your vendor for. I guess that's probably the long answer. But SOC 1s are really specifically geared towards services performed by your vendors, which are relevant to a company's financial reporting. SOC 2s have a much broader scope, as well as kind of the advantage of having defined auditable criteria, so that trust service criteria. But generally speaking, a SOC 2 is going to have far more information surrounding information system and data protection controls than a SOC 1. I always recommend reviewing a SOC 2 if you have the option, especially for your high-risk, critical, and technology vendors. That being said, SOC 1s really should also be covering a lot of that same material at a higher level. I shy away from giving SOC 1s an excuse to not cover technology controls because they really should. They just often don't cover them as well, and it's not as honed in. So really the general rule of thumb is if you get to choose, if a vendor has both options, go with the SOC 2 report.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, as a reminder, in the related content widget, you'll find our Reviewing and Understanding a Vendor SOC Report interactive guide and ebook, which is a great SOC resource for your reference. Back to you, Lisa.
Okay, so jumping into the content of a SOC report and what to review within them, one of the first key components to mention is going to be the system description and the scope of the report. You're really going to want to pay attention to determining whether the vendor provided the correct report to you. To do this, you want to look at the scope of the report. You can find this in the Independent Service Auditor's report. You can also find it in Section 3 in the narrative. But you want to make sure that you're looking at the correct report for the product and service that you use here. Larger providers can get into the mid-upper 10s, 20s, count of SOC reports for their organization. So it's a lot to shuffle through, a lot of them tied together. You'll likely have multiple products from some of these large vendors. So you just want to make sure that you're reviewing what you think you're reviewing and that it's clearly called out. So another important data point to look for in SOC reports is whether your vendor uses a subservice organization or not for any critical services. The update to the SSAE 18 standard included a notable item when discussing vendor management. It introduced the concept of complementary subservice organization controls. These are controls that the vendor expects their subservice to be doing, and it basically now requires that these are clearly laid out within your SOC report. Organizations have two options with how to treat subservice organizations. They can use the inclusive method, which brings key controls from the subservice into the audit scope, and the auditor will actually include those subservice controls in the final report. or the carve-out method, which is what we see probably 90 to 95% of the time. This is where controls at the subservice are scoped out. They're not included in the report. They're literally carved out. Understanding what subservices your vendor uses is important because they may be using a subservice organization for critical controls that impact the product or service that you are contracting with them for. That's information that you want to understand and track. These service providers used by your vendor are your fourth parties, and if your third party is critical to your operations, then you have to understand their critical vendor SOC reports. I highly encourage you to request your vendors send you their vendors' SOC reports too, and review them in case they're inadequate or something has changed, especially in our current operating environment. It's important to be in the know, and you're responsible for those fourth parties as well. One of the most important components of a SOC report that you're going to want to review is the auditor's opinion. This can be found right in Section 1. There are 4 types of opinions: unqualified, qualified, disclaimer, and adverse. An unqualified opinion, though sounds bad, is actually the best news you can hear when you're talking about SOC report opinions. Unqualified is really the standard expectation, and you're not necessarily going to see the words unqualified opinion within the report anywhere, which can sometimes be confusing. But when the auditors feel that the vendor's description fairly represents the system and that controls were suitably designed, and in the case of Type 2 reports that controls are operating effectively, then the report is considered unqualified. It basically just means that everything is as it should be. One thing to keep in mind about unqualified reports is even though that's what you want to see, you can still have a number of exceptions or findings in an unqualified report. A qualified opinion is where the vendor had at least one control objective that was not implemented or operating effectively. So in other words, a qualified report is going to indicate that issues identified in the report were significant enough to deem one or more controls ineffective. You're going to want to make a special note of a qualified opinion because you should really make sure to follow up and that was resolved. A disclaimer is used when there isn't any evidence to prove or disprove that a control wasn't being performed or was in place. This happens a lot on controls that surround what are hopefully rare occurrences, such as communicating incidents or breaches to clients. An adverse opinion is bad. This means that the vendor held back or modified information needed to verify controls were either in place or operating effectively. An adverse opinion is a definite red flag. All right, let's look at the actual audit part of a SOC report. SOC reports are built around the vendor's control objectives. These are overall goals for a function. Control activities support the control objectives, and auditors create tests for those activities where they might review, observe, or even interview, all to determine whether the control that's in place, or for Type 2s, whether they're operating effectively. If that testing doesn't go well, or if there's nothing to test, then the exceptions occur, and in more severe cases, you'll find significant deficiencies and material weaknesses come into play. Though you don't want to see any of those things, it is very common to have exceptions. And exceptions really occur when not every sample that was tested passed. So you really want to look at those and risk rate them, review the management's response. If one wasn't given, ask the vendor for one. And you want to look for mitigations that were placed, compensating controls. See if the vendor has since corrected the exception. Things like significant deficiencies are when a control or combination of controls are shown not to be working as designed, or if the control is being performed by someone unqualified to do so. Material weaknesses come from testing, showing that controls are not functioning, resulting in clients not being able to rely on that function of the vendor. Though much less common, significant deficiencies and material weaknesses are really important to notate when found. So to summarize the opinion component and exceptions, You want to look at the opinion to determine whether the report is what we would call clean with an unqualified opinion. And if not, what qualified the report? What was not operating effectively? Then look for any exceptions, and just make sure to remember that an unqualified report can still have exceptions. So reading that opinion is not the end of what you need to do to make sure that everything is as it should be. You want to determine the impact to your organization from any exceptions that you found, review the management's response if one was given, and then look for any mitigating or compensating controls in place to lessen the impact of that exception. Understanding the impact of the opinion and any exceptions is going to be really key to reviewing your SOC report for your organization. One aspect that many users of SOC reports don't realize is that the organization being audited, so your vendor in this case, is the one that's actually writing and designing the controls, not the auditor. The control wording is included within the audit report, as are the tests that the auditor performed. So in reviewing the report in detail, you can better determine the value of the report to you. The SOC is still a better tool than trying to review a vendor's policy and program documentation. At the very least, a SOC report, their controls are transparently audited by a third party. And there are guidelines, and the auditors will assist as needed. But the depth of each control is determined by the vendor. Due to that flexibility, we always say that SOC reports are not created equally. This is one reason why having a SOC reviewed by a vendor management expert can be extremely valuable, because they can identify the gaps in these control depths. So another key area that I want to make sure that we cover in this session is complementary user entity controls, or QEs, as you may hear them called. These are controls that you, as the user entity, must have in place as part of the service provider's control environment. These are controls you implement within your organization, and they complement the controls at the vendor. You need to review these annually and document that you are in compliance with them. Every year, we're having more and more clients inform us that their auditors or examiners are requesting documented evidence that they have implemented QEs. So we kind of recommend the following high-level steps to meet that demand. You want to review the QEs and their associated control objectives to ensure context. Determine which QEs apply to you, because not all of them are going to apply, and you want to knock the ones out right away that don't apply. You want to assign each QE that does apply to a specific person, team, or role for responsibility. That allows for accountability. Determine which QEs are addressed already through your program policies and processes, your internal and external audits. And if you find that you know that you're doing things and they're just not written down, so unwritten controls, document them. A lot of times you're doing things that you don't even realize that you're doing because they're not written down, and so this is a good exercise, because if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. Then you want to make sure, once you've identified which QEs you need to address, you want to make sure that you address them and document that you have addressed them on an annual basis. Record that in an easy-to-read format, so you have the QE, who it's assigned to, how it was addressed, and the date. And then you want to assess your QEs with each new SOC report and with any significant or internal changes to that organization. Okay, so to kind of wrap up on SOC reports, here are some best practices. Understanding the SOC you're reviewing is an important point. Everyone's SOC knowledge is continually growing, just at different stages. SOC reports are changing in real time. Make sure you have the correct SOC report and that it covers a relevant time period. You want to make sure the report that you're reviewing matches with the services provided and that you're using the vendor for, and that the reporting period is as current as possible. You want to look for areas or criteria that you feel are not present and should be. Really recognizing not just the controls that are present, but the gaps. Maybe your data center or cloud provider doesn't include availability in their trust service criteria for a SOC 2. That's something that I would really look into. It may be something smaller, such as the vendor not including any network or server management controls. This hopefully signifies that they have a critical subserve, but you'll want to determine the possible impacts of that to you. Look at these areas and understand what is and is not included or in scope. And you want to make sure that you document any areas of ambiguity and reach out to the vendor for follow-up. You want to make sure you evaluate any fourth-party relationships. Look at the risk and impact of any exceptions. And of course, don't forget those complementary user entity controls. Though some reports don't have them, most do, and it's really important that you review them and document that and address them. There's so much to know about SOC reports, and I was really only able to cover a small amount in our short time today. But VendMinder has a lot of resources available, including infographics, blog posts, podcasts. We're always creating new content, and really the most recent 2 on SOC reports that are addressing something that we didn't even talk about today, which is the alignment of the SOC 2 trust service criteria to COSO 2013. So lots of great resources out there. Okay, so now that we've taken some time to talk about SOC reports, let's dive right into cybersecurity, which is another really important area of information security to kind of look at on an ongoing basis. So we all know that information security is important for protecting your organization. Cybersecurity has been in the spotlight for a while now, but it's even more of a hot topic these last few years, especially since the pandemic started. It seems every day is a new breach, new vulnerabilities. These are happening to big and small businesses and in every industry. And it really is just a reminder that nobody's immune. So today, we're going to talk about what exactly is vendor cybersecurity posture, why vendor cybersecurity is so important, which of your vendors should you review, when do you need to review them, the top 4 areas of vendor cybersecurity to review, and then what to do if you're notified of a breach. So we're really going to dig deeper into cybersecurity as part of that ongoing stage of the life cycle. Cybersecurity documentation is crucial in today's and threats to security. So when we talk about your vendor's cybersecurity posture, what does that mean? Really, what we're saying is your vendor prepared to prevent, detect, and respond to a cybersecurity issue or event? Many organizations invest very heavily into their own cybersecurity programs, but often forget to invest in ensuring that their vendors are doing the same. And that's what we really do through third-party risk management. To help identify whether your vendor's posture is appropriate, you first want to identify the cyber threats your vendor could present and take proactive steps to mitigate potential areas of weakness. To do this, you're going to perform risk assessments to determine those threats and vulnerabilities that your organization faces by using each vendor. Next, take the appropriate steps to determine whether your vendor and your customer's data is or will be secure. Prior to signing a contract, proper due diligence should be performed and ongoing monitoring should be performed thereafter. And then really you want to review if and how your vendor is prepared to prevent, detect, and respond to a cybersecurity issue or event. So why is it so important? Well, there's always an increase in risk when you use a third party. But that's especially true today when we look at the dramatic increase in work-from-home environments and changes in infrastructure within organizations. Monitoring your vendor's cybersecurity posture is important because it enables you to mitigate risk by allowing you to influence the vendor to strengthen their controls or supplement their controls with your own, or make a decision on whether or not you should stay with that vendor. So a vendor breach can have a huge impact on you and your brand. This is just simply what we call reputational risk, and it's a huge factor. Cybersecurity is also a hot button for regulators. They're watching you more than ever. So you really need to stay on top of it and prove that you're staying on top of it. It's commonly required that you demonstrate you're taking proactive steps to identify and mitigate potential areas of weakness with your vendors. You are expected to cover the CIA information triad, which we'll cover next. For those vendors on the call, when you're fielding all the due diligence requests that you're getting, just remember that in many cases, these clients are required by a government or industry standard or regulation to gather all of this information from you to ensure that they can safely continue doing business with you. If you want to serve the industries, you need to be prepared. There have been several notable breaches just in the last several months alone, including places like Marriott, Shields Healthcare Group, Cash App. And then here are just a couple of other examples. If you've been paying attention to the news, you would have seen some of the big breaches that have been making the headlines. 5 states, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Utah, and Virginia, have all enacted comprehensive consumer data privacy laws. They all have several items in common, such as the right to access and delete personal information and to opt out of the sale of personal information. More states are following suit, with some waiting in the hopes of a federal law that will keep things more cohesive and clear across the board. But regardless, these are just more reason why it's so important. In third-party risk management, it's true what they say. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Industry best practice and regulatory guidance wants you to consider all the potential ramifications posed by a third party, whether it's in the form of a data breach or a business disruption. From a planning standpoint, you need to consider all the possible problems that could occur, what steps you need to be prepared to take, and how long until normal operations can resume in order to minimize the impact to your organization and your customers. And you want to remember, too, that the work you do has to be documented. If it isn't documented, it didn't really happen, and this is especially true for regulators. Not all vendors need to be considered from a cybersecurity standpoint, but someone has to make that determination and then be careful in how they do so, and then you need to take the steps to make sure that you're documenting that review. So in cybersecurity, we talk about the CIA information security triad. But what is that? Really, it's the foundation of cybersecurity, and it includes confidentiality, which is preventing the unauthorized disclosure of information. To guarantee confidentiality, vendor communication channels and media have to be properly monitored and controlled to prevent unauthorized access. There are a few key concepts, such as things like the principle of least privilege, separation of duties, that can really start you down the right path towards confidentiality. The I stands for integrity. This means to ensure that data is not modified by unauthorized means. To guarantee integrity under the CIA triad, vendors should be able to demonstrate that they have controls in place to protect information from unauthorized modification. One way to do this is by ensuring proper input, processing, and output controls are in place. And the A stands for availability. This is ensuring that information is available when needed and only to those authorized to have it. Vendors should be able to validate how they prevent and handle downtime and interruptions. In this current environment, ensuring your vendor has a solid pandemic plan that includes things like infrastructure capacities, such as what tolerances their network have to expand to remote working capabilities, are all just little parts of this availability concept. So when dealing with cybersecurity risk, we really need to understand what type of vendors should be reviewed. At a minimum, you want to review your high and critical risk vendors. But how do you determine which vendors are high or critical risk? And really the simplest way is to ask yourself a few questions about each vendor. Does the vendor process, store, or transmit non-public customer data such as PII or personally identifiable information? And does the vendor provide a part of your service that would degrade your service's value if it were unavailable? And once you determine which vendors you'll review, who's going to perform those reviews? On the cybersecurity side of due diligence, you want someone with demonstrable knowledge across information security to perform your reviews. It should be someone with experience so that the review doesn't turn into a mindless checkbox activity. That person likely won't be your third-party risk manager directly, but rather a supporting resource from your internal information security team. If these resources aren't available within your organization, you might want to look at a third-party risk management service provider for assistance. You want to ensure that the process continues with the manager in charge of the relationship with the vendor so that when additional action needs to be taken, the vendor review isn't just performed as a checkbox activity to the organization itself. Accountability is a big part of the process.
Our second poll question of the day is, when do you perform a cybersecurity assessment on a vendor with access to consumer data or your systems? Pre-contract signing and annually thereafter as part of vendor management. Post-contract signing is a part of vendor management. When resources are available, cybersecurity is not included as part of our due diligence or vendor management process, or you're not sure. Lisa, I have another question here that I think we could go ahead and answer. And that question is, do you have any recommendations for the best resources to keep up with happenings in the cybersecurity space?
Oh gosh, there are so many, and it really depends on how far down the rabbit hole you want to go. For mainstream websites, I really like cyberwire.com, hackernews.com, wired.com, and then cnbc.com/cybersecurity is another good one. If you're more of a listen versus read, so like podcasts, I would recommend the Darknet Diaries. They have a really good podcast. Naked Security podcast is another good one. I also use sites like SANS Internet Storm Center. CyberWire, again, has a daily feed. Black Hills Information Security and the John Strand Group, they do really good stuff. For educational resources, I love the Professor Messer's Security Plus study group. And then, of course, Palo Alto Network's Unit 42 blog is a great read. I mean, I could really go on. There's a ton out there. We have a running list within my department that we kind of always add to as we find new stuff. And I'm always willing to share that when asked. So I can get that list together and we can get that out to anyone who's interested in kind of seeing that on paper.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our top 4 areas of vendor cybersecurity to pay attention to infographic, which is available for download in the related content widget.
So talking about cybersecurity reviews, what should you review? We've briefly talked about the who and the when, so let's take a deeper look at the what. As you're reviewing your vendor's cyber reports, there are really 4 primary areas to take a closer look at, and that's cyber security testing, sensitive data security, employee, contractor, and vendor management, and incident detection and response. This can also include things like cybersecurity insurance coverage. Let's take a deeper look into each of these. So starting with security testing, this is really just a great way to identify weakness in a tangible format. Your vendor's reported security testing should include things like regular, standardized penetration testing of both their internal and external networks, as well as social engineering testing. Social engineering testing should include things like simulating phishing emails, employee awareness tests. Regular security testing should also come with documented follow-ups to any findings, as well as mitigation of any issues that were found. You're going to want to make sure that your vendor has demonstrated that they're testing for weakness, following up on the issues, and then fixing them timely. You always want to see that loop closed. Your vendor should be able to provide documented evidence that security testing is done at least annually, and really you want to see it done by an impartial third party. The next area to consider is sensitive data security. This really means, like, how does your vendor protect data from destructive forces and from the unwanted actions of unauthorized users? Understanding how vendors secure your data at rest and in transit is monumental. They should have controls in place such as encryption, data retention, destruction policies, data classification and privacy policies, access management, etc. These are all part of securing sensitive data. In the last several years, you have this new environment where you want to make sure that your vendor also has measures in place for sensitive data security with any changes they make to work environments. If their workforce was working from home now, what measures do they have in place to secure data for remote workers? Is this covered in their pandemic planning? Is this something that they considered? It's all important to kind of understand how able are they to transition to a different environment if necessary. Another area to consider is how your vendor manages their employees, contractors, and their vendors. We all know that employees are oftentimes the weakest link in an organization when it comes to information security. With employee, contractor, and vendor management, you have to understand the vendor's ability to ensure their agents are prepared to protect your data. Training of these groups, as well as documented and enforced access management, are critical to data protection. Confidentiality agreements, security training, management of vendors, and access management are just some of the ways that third parties can offer an assurance that anyone with access to your data is properly trained. So incident detection and response, as well as cybersecurity insurance coverage, is the final area we recommend focusing on in this presentation. An incident can be anything that affects the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of information or of an information system. Ultimately, incidents happen. It's inevitable. The key to minimizing the impact is discovering them quickly and having a plan already in place to address them effectively. So how do your vendors identify an incident? Do they have an effective response plan and a notification procedure? Your vendor should be able to demonstrate what they do if an incident occurs, how follow-up and resolution is performed, as well as notification steps. As far as insurance goes, errors and omissions, cybercrime, and sabotage are just some insurance coverages that offer a level of risk transfer and protection against cyber exposures. Cyber insurance is never a substitute for security, but it can offer a level of assurance that a vendor takes cybersecurity seriously.
Our next poll question is, how many of your third-party contracts require incident notification parameters? All, some, only high or critical risk vendors, none, or not sure. Lisa, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And that question is it common for vendors to release their social engineering and vulnerability testing results for review?
Generally speaking, no, and we're actually okay with that in most cases. When you see a vendor that's willing to provide full unredacted test results, we actually see that kind of as a negative, as those are some of the most sensitive documents an organization can have. And really, they outline exactly how to attack an organization's technical infrastructure. In most cases, overviews of testing should suffice. It should incorporate types of findings, their criticality, if those findings have been remediated, and along with who performed the tests, how often the tests were performed. You want to look for things like what type of penetration tests are actually done. There's so many different types out there and factors involved. So you really want to see that overall umbrella of information. And then you really ideally would like to see that it was performed by a third party. And then that third party, generally speaking, has a template for how a summary is put out there for people to be able to read them without getting confidential information. So if a vendor is unwilling to even disclose a summary of the information, then you really need to consider if you have the correct right to audit language in your contracts. And if they're willing to give you too much information, you kind of want to look at that as well as a red flag.
And here are those results. Thank you to everyone for answering this question, as it is interesting to see what everyone says. Before we move on, I'll quickly call out that our vendor cybersecurity checklist is available in the related content widget. You can use this handy checklist to ensure you're retrieving the right information as you assess a vendor's cybersecurity. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Lisa.
So what if your vendor is breached? Then what do? What's next? Proactively, you want to ensure that data breach notification requirements are documented in your contract language. You want to ensure that you have set expectations with your vendor. If the breach originated from your vendor, then you're going to want to perform deep audit testing after. If the vendor is unwilling to cooperate, then you have bigger issues and should consider that partnership. This type of post-breach activity should be defined in your contracts. You want to make sure that when you're writing up that contract language that you're laying out your expectations and that you and your vendor agree on them so that there's no gray area if the worst happens. Next, you're going to want to define the impact of the breach. Understand what you're dealing with. Was the breach isolated to one individual? Did it impact multiple customers? Making sure that you're kept in the loop of those things is essential. Defining the impact is imperative because you're going to have to be transparent when it's your turn to make notifications. This is why adopting a customer notification process internally is also crucial. It's best to notify the impacted customers directly than for them to hear it secondhand or see it on the news. Where required, you might also have to notify the state AG, law enforcement, or other regulators, so you just want to make sure you have as much time as humanly possible. There are also things that you're going to want to consider in-house as well, such as assessing your overall information security processes. Document updates and implement refresher training for all employees. You want to make sure that you are not the weakest link. And then you're going to, after the fact, you're going to want to implement more robust user authentication procedures. When we're talking about restoring customer faith, one way to do that is to offer credit monitoring services. Ultimately, a data breach that contains PII of the customer may increase the individual risk of identity theft. So it's a show of good faith to offer credit monitoring services to anyone impacted. But having a plan for that in place is going to be a big deal as well. So as we wrap up cybersecurity and third-party risk management, you just want to kind of remember that many companies are spending a lot of money on their cybersecurity programs, but they're often not transferring those dollars and investing in ensuring that their vendors are doing the same. You want to take the necessary precautions to understand your vendor's cybersecurity posture. You can reduce the risk of your vendors and contractors becoming your weakest link by ensuring that you have a process and a plan in place. At the very least, you want to thoroughly review your vendor's approach to security testing. Regular security testing should also come with documented follow-up to findings as well as mitigation of any issues that were found. You're going to want to make sure that your vendor has demonstrated that they are testing for weaknesses, following up on issues, and truly fixing them. You also want to review your vendor's approach to sensitive data security. Again, understanding how vendors secure your data at rest and in transit is so important. They should have controls in place such as data retention, encryption, destruction policies, data classification and privacy policies, access management. These are all part of securing sensitive data. And then you want to make sure that you're looking at employee, contractor, and vendor management. You want to make sure you can understand the vendor's ability to ensure that their agents are prepared to protect your data. Training of these groups, as well as documented and enforced policies and procedures like access management, are critical. And then finally, incident detection and response, as well as cybersecurity insurance coverage. An incident can be anything that affects the confidentiality, integrity, availability of information, or that CIA triad. Incidents happen. We know this. The key to minimizing those impacts, again, is discovering those issues quickly and then having a documented plan in place to address them effectively. So how do your vendors do that? How do they identify an incident? What do they define as an incident? Do they have an effective response plan in place? And then what's that notification procedure? Is that written into your contract language? Your vendor should be able to demonstrate what they do if an incident occurs, how follow-up and resolution is performed, as well as those notification steps. But then you also have to determine if all of those things work for you and align with your cybersecurity program. Just remember that by failing to properly manage your vendor's cybersecurity risk, you become vulnerable to breaches and the regulatory and reputational and financial consequence that comes with that. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa, for those informative sessions. Before we move on to our next session, where Hershey will discuss vendor business continuity management, we're going to take a quick 5-minute break. Please meet us back right here in 5 minutes. You do not need to close out and log back in. Just simply leave everything as is. Welcome back, everyone. Now we are going to move into our next ongoing monitoring session, which covers how vendor business continuity and disaster recovery fit in. We will hear from Hershey Long, VinMinder's Senior Information Security Specialist. Hershey, the floor is now yours.
Thanks, Jesse. So Lisa did a great overview of SOC reports and cybersecurity. Now we'll talk about vendor business continuity and disaster recovery. We will cover an overview of business continuity management. Then we will talk about the understanding of what business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans are. Then we will go into what procedures your vendor needs to have to handle a business impacting event. Finally, we'll talk about how to ensure that they've taken precaution and tested those plans. Like SOX and cybersecurity, a vendor's business continuity management also comes into play in almost all the stages. So let's dive deeper within the ongoing stage. You have to check in on business continuity management and be aware of changes, as well as review the testing to ensure they're meeting standards. Risk fluctuates, and a business impacting event can happen suddenly and at any given time. So you'll want to ensure your vendors have proper business continuity management plans in place at all times. Now, I know most of us are probably tired of hearing about COVID-19, but COVID-19 is still making an impact today. Business continuity management, or BCM for short, is still relevant more so than ever. So when we're talking about BCM, here are some things that we need to consider. Update your plans based on lessons learned from COVID-19. Develop a BCM program and crisis management team that includes representatives from all business units from all geographic regions. Conduct a business impact analysis, or BIA, for the organization and update it regularly for changes to business and IT operations. Assess the importance of third parties to the organization and develop recovery strategies for those deemed mission critical. Plan for multiple business disruptions occurring at the same time. And then finally, leverage pandemic management as a catalyst for integrated business and crisis management operations. Now, BCM is a comprehensive program designed to support and protect an organization's overall operations. It's an umbrella term that encompasses three major areas of focus, those being business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic planning. Now, when we're talking about business continuity, we're talking about what an organization does to ensure that key operations, products, and services continue to be delivered either in full or at a predetermined time or an accepted level of availability after a business impacting event. Disaster recovery, on the other hand, is a subset of business continuity. Disaster recovery outlines the processes and procedures that the organization will follow at the immediate onset of an incident up to and including the organization getting back to normal operations. Disaster recovery also is typically IT-centric and involves recovery of the information technology environment, while business continuity handles resumption of operations and the organization as a whole. So something to note is that business continuity really deals more with people and places and buildings, while disaster recovery deals more with information technology, hardware, servers, databases, and such. Now, pandemic planning is another subset of business continuity. Now, many tend to think that if they have a business continuity plan, they're okay and they're prepared for a pandemic. However, this is actually not the case. Pandemic planning is preparing for a pandemic event by planning, exercising, and translating plans into actions as part of a response. So as an example, a pandemic event is a major health crisis like COVID-19 or maybe a huge influenza outbreak. When it comes to your vendors, this serves as a roadmap which communicates how they plan to communicate business services while facing a pandemic. The absence of necessary infrastructure and planning for critical situations such as COVID-19 or influenza outbreak can lead to a cascade of failures, resulting in a breakdown of processes and an interruption of supplies and services. Keeping an eye on your vendors, especially your high-risk and critical vendors. Business continuity, disaster, and pandemic plans is crucial for protecting your employees, your customers, and your overall business operations. A vendor's BCM program should align with its strategic goals and objectives. Management should consider a vendor's role within and impact on the overall industry when it develops a BCM program. Remember this, real-life scenarios will happen. It's just a matter of time. We talk about what could happen, all kinds of natural disasters, man-made disasters, and they're all different. You want to know what plans your vendor has in place for these events. So let's look at a couple of example situations here. So the first one, if a flood destroyed your check and paper products in the vendor's storage facility, do they have a secondary storage facility or emergency supply of stock to enable them to continue operations until new stock can be ordered and received? If an electrical fire destroys your vendor's server room, will they be able to get it back up and running? Your online banking provider is a victim of a cyber attack leading to the exposure of 1 million customer records. Is your vendor ready to respond with their communications plan and a designated public speaker? Did they contact you to tell you about the cyber attack, or did you have to contact them to explain after it's on the news? Here's a familiar one. What if a pandemic hits and is preventing your vendor's employees from accessing the office and now they are forced to work from home? Are they prepared to work from home? Vendors should consider if employees have the resources needed to work from home, such as capable internet connection, a working laptop, VPN, and access to IT support.
We are to the first poll question of session 4. This poll question is, do you ask where your vendor's BCM program reports to in their organization? Yes, no, not sure, or not applicable. And Hershey, while we wait for the results to tabulate on this one, let's answer another question from the audience. And that question is, many of my vendors won't provide their business continuity plans when we ask for them during due diligence request. Do you have any advice?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we see the same when performing assessments for our clients. That said, I don't necessarily disagree with vendors not providing their full business continuity and disaster recovery plans, as they often do include more sensitive information. What we like to see is a summary of the plan or an overview of the program. It should include recovery time and point objectives, what mitigating steps are in place, such as a secondary data center environment to operate from, whether all employees can work remotely, notification process, and of course a summary of their most recent tests, which should have when the tests were performed, whether the tests were successful, and whether any findings from the tests have been resolved or even mitigated. So to sum that all up, if they won't give you the full plans and test results, just ask for the summary. They can't just say everything is confidential.
Okay, great. And just a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. Thank you. Okay, everyone, here are those results. Thank you for submitting your responses. Before we move on, as a reminder, in the related content widget, you'll find our How to Analyze a Vendor's Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery Plans ebook that goes into depth about what you need to know to access a vendor's plans. Hershey, back to you.
So, who should be reviewing a vendor's business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans? It should be someone that understands the business requirements for the availability of that vendor and the impacts of that vendor not being available. The process of reviewing a vendor's business continuity and disaster recovery starts with reviewing the vendor's business impact analysis, or BIA. The BIA will define recovery time objectives, or RTO, recovery point objectives, or RPO, and maximum tolerable downtime, or MTD. Gotta love all these acronyms here. You'll want to verify that all these timelines your vendor sets, especially the RTO and RPO, fall within your organization's timelines and expectations for response. Now, the BIA is a process which forecasts what might happen if your organization experiences a business impacting event and gathers information needed to determine how you recover from those events. Relating to vendor management, your operations, of course, may be impacted by one of your vendors if they are experiencing a business impacting event, which may immediately impact your operations or may have a delayed impact to your operations if the vendor doesn't resume normal operations quickly. The RTO is the amount of time it's expected to take to recover back to normal operations or at a predefined acceptable state. Determining the RTO is important for selecting appropriate technologies and strategies. When it's not feasible to meet an RTO, management should verify whether the RTO is realistic, initiate an action plan and milestones to document the situation, and when appropriate, plan for its mitigation. The RPO represents the point in time before disruption to which data can be recovered. For example, if you do a backup once a day at 1 a.m., if a business impacting event occurs at midnight, you're going to lose all of the data from the prior 23 hours. So the lowest RPO an organization that only backs up once per day could have is 24 hours. The MTD represents the total amount of time the system owner or authorizing official is willing to accept for a business process disruption and includes all impact considerations. The MTD is important for contingency planners when selecting an appropriate recovery method and developing the scope and depth of recovery procedures. Examiners may encounter other terminology to describe the MTD, such as maximum allowable downtime. Now let's look at an example for RTO. An organization has service level agreements that states that the RTO is 4 hours, meaning that the business processes must be restored after a disaster within 4 hours to avoid unacceptable consequences associated with a break in continuity. So let's just say today at noon, there was a severe weather has caused damage to the roof of the organization's office, and all personnel are evacuated and services are immediately interrupted. Now, according to the RTO that was written in the SLA, the organization's services need to be back up by 4 p.m. If the organization has high SLA requirements for credits and ability for clients to avoid their contract, the organization will likely opt for an RTO of under 4 hours. If the penalties are not as harsh, such as if the vendor is not critical, often the RTO will be much higher. It's not uncommon to see vendors have RTOs that are 24 hours or even 48 hours. Now, here's an example of RPO. Now, say that same organization decides on a 12-hour RPO and a backup of data is taken at 1 p.m. The next scheduled backup is for 1 a.m. Any disaster that occurs between 1 p.m. and 1 a.m. can be restored to the 1 p.m. backup, therefore resulting in a maximum of a 12-hour loss of data. Now, if instead the organization had replication in place where files are immediately transferred to another location, the RPO could be much lower to potentially just seconds. Having replication in place is much more expensive than performing nightly backups. So it's a trade-off which must be evaluated by the organization and their clients. And here's an example of MTD. The same organization has determined that their MTD is 8 hours. If the service and scope of the SLA is down for an extended period, SLA penalties could build to a point where it is no longer financially feasible to recover and continue business operations. The organization may decide to file bankruptcy and not recover. You should evaluate whether there are appropriate resources to ensure resiliency. Determine your vendor's resiliency by asking for the following items: evidence of physical resilience, SOC 2 Type 2 reports and independent audits to determine cyber resilience, data backup and replication strategies being used, a pandemic plan covering the loss of personnel, the vendor's change management policy and program, event management plans, facilities and infrastructure locations, data center recovery alternatives, branch relocations, electrical power redundancies, and telecommunications redundancy plans, and any other items that you could think of that would determine or help determine your vendor's resiliency. Now, it's likely that the vendor has a BCP or a business continuity plan. However, their preparedness should meet or exceed your own plans, or you may need to supplement your own plans. It's important that you not only obtain a copy of their plans, but that you review them to ensure what they plan to do is sufficient. So what should you review once you receive their plans? So here's some key points to take a look at to give you an idea if your vendor is actually prepared for a disruption. You want to look at your testing procedures. You want to check to see that the plan is reviewed, tested, and updated regularly, that senior management and board approval is included. You'll want to review SLAs and contractual obligations. Another item to know about is failover and backup locations. You'll also want to know about their personnel loss and planning, relocation plans, remote access availability, facility loss contingencies, pandemic contingencies, that offsite copies of the plan are kept. And also know about the breach disruption and notification procedures. This one is very important because it's all about the timing of when they tell you that a breach has happened. Like I've already mentioned, this is something to include in your contract. So if you do in fact include it in the contract, review it that they've actually put it in their actual plans. Now we've covered what to review in a business continuity plan. Now let's go over what to cover in disaster recovery plans. It's important to ensure a vendor can survive in the face of a disaster so that you know your organization will as well. So again, don't just collect their disaster recovery plan, review it. And reviewing the disaster recovery plan is very similar to reviewing the business continuity plan. You're going to review some of these key points. Be sure the key individuals and teams for handling disasters, along with a communication plan, are outlined in the disaster recovery plan. Plans need to be tested and exercised on a regular basis. Notification process. Again, what is their process to notify you of their disaster-related events? This one is different from the business continuity plan. You want to look for backup procedures. These backup procedures should be in place, such as on-site backups, off-site backups, alternate locations, data replication, annual testing of backups, and more. Of course, you want to make sure that the disaster recovery plan has been approved by senior management or a board of directors, and then that the plans are reviewed and updated regularly or when significant changes occur. So, for example, changes to the environment internally or externally, if new equipment is being purchased or they're moving from a typical data center or co-location arrangement to like a cloud solution, such as an infrastructure or a platform as a service, then these instances must be accounted for and the plan should either be created or adjusted accordingly. It's very important that you monitor your vendor's pandemic plans. As you review your vendor's plans, look at their cybersecurity measures around working location. For example, if they're working from home, there's stress on systems, internet service providers, and cable service providers. The whole internet gets stressed at a time like this, so you want to make sure everything is worked out. Also, refer to regulatory guidance. Make sure you're compliant if you need to be. And take note of all regulatory guidance out there on this topic, as it will only benefit you and make everything stronger, even if certain regulation or guidance doesn't specifically apply to you. Communicate your plans and your expectations to your vendors so you're on the same page prior to and during these events. Test your plan and ensure your vendors test their plans frequently. Testing is a key to success. Continue to review your vendor's business impact analysis against your own. Reminder, the BIA is an analysis to determine whether your organization can operate effectively while the vendor is unavailable. The BIA is critical to continuing operations. It needs to be risk-based, and you need to be sure you figure out what systems are most important and a plan you can count on to recover those systems. Continually catch if changes are made in the business continuity, disaster recovery, or pandemic plans, and that they still meet your expectations. Refer to and stay updated on regulatory guidance, as I mentioned. It does change. Make sure you're compliant if you need to be. Communicate your plans and your expectations to your vendors so you're on the same page prior to and during these events. Also, test the plans frequently, as it might look on paper, but once it's played out, you realize further gaps. Before we wrap up, let's talk a little bit about testing. For your critical vendors, it's preferred that there's a full-scale exercise that has taken place annually. Limited-scale exercises are great to a point, but it all comes back to the amount of risk involved. Full-scale exercises in themselves are inherently risky many times, depending on the configuration and technologies involved. Yet another reason that testing is important. An organization will build up to a full-scale exercise after first performing tabletop exercises, where required personnel walk through a theoretical business impacting event and the actions they take to mitigate and recover from that event. Next, an organization would perform, if it were a technology services software as a service vendor, for example, a failover to their secondary data center, but without transferring internet traffic to the failover system. This is a simulation testing. This would only be performing tests on the failover system to ensure it is a functional copy of the system. Then they might invite a small number of clients to participate in the following test or perform the test transferring internet traffic to the secondary facility during off-peak hours so that if there are issues, only a small subset of people are impacted.
The next poll question is, do you review your critical third parties' business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans on a regular recurring basis? Yes, no, not sure, or not applicable. Hershey, here's another question for you from the audience. Where does emergency management come into play with business continuity management?
Oh, that's another great question. We don't do this too much, but emergency management is really also part of an organization's plan, or at least related to it. Emergency management focuses on planning for and coordinating their response to mitigate and recover from a disaster situation where the safety of personnel is involved. So, for example, building evacuation plans for fires, safe zone planning for tornadoes, what to do in case of an earthquake, and other cases where lives may be in danger.
Great, thanks so much, Hershey. Please go ahead and submit your responses. We will be closing this poll in about 30 seconds. Thank you. If you have any issues submitting the poll, please submit those questions in the Ask Question widget, and we'll be happy to assist. Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our Vendor Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery Checklist, available for download in the Related Content widget. You can use this checklist to determine whether your third-party vendor has adequate plans in place. I'll hand it back to you, Hershey.
All right, now let's wrap this up with a few best practices for reviewing business continuity, disaster recovery, and pandemic plans. You'll want to continuously request your high and critical risk third parties plans and be thorough in your assessment. Prioritize reviewing your business impact analysis, your BIA. Communicate with your vendors. Have clear guidelines on what must be done throughout the relationship. Watch for signs of a stressed vendor. Check that relocation plans are clear. Review your critical vendors' remote operations. Ensure plans include contingencies on mass absenteeism following disease control guidelines. Confirm that you have a redundancy plan. Stay on top of SLAs included in the contract when you signed it during the onboarding stage. Record anticipated results, assess any vulnerabilities, and thoroughly document those. And finally, refer to recent regulatory guidance. Now, Jesse, I'll pass it back to you to introduce the next part of this session.
Thanks so much, Hershey, for that informative presentation. Now we are going to move into our next session of the day, which is financial health in the ongoing monitoring process. And it's presented by VinMinder CFO, Raman Zachariah. Raman, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Jesse. Today's agenda, as it pertains to reviewing vendors' financial health, will focus on what you need to be doing and looking at on an ongoing basis, making sure that your vendor has a strong financial health profile, and what to do if they don't, and then we'll go through some of the existing resources you could utilize in your day-to-day vendor financial health reviews across your business. So let's jump right in. The third-party risk management lifecycle, as you all have heard throughout these presentations from some of my colleagues during this boot camp, is inclusive of the onboarding, the ongoing, and the offboarding phases. As it pertains to reviewing vendor financial health, you're typically going to do that in the ongoing phase. It's not to say that you won't do it when you're also onboarding financial vendor, any sort of vendors, and reviewing their financial health, but typically this is an ongoing exercise in performing any sort of vendor financial health review. So we'll try to focus a lot of our content and also the topics at hand as it pertains to performing a financial health review within the context of the ongoing phase in the overall third-party risk management lifecycle. In order to visualize how a poor financial health and high risk when you perform your financial health can impact your business, it's important to visualize it as a domino effect. When you have declining financial performance, it can lead to downstream issues like falling dominoes across that vendor's service levels that can ultimately hurt your organization. So always good to start early when performing your financial health reviews and make sure you have a regular cadence of doing that to avoid this. So you may be asking how you can avoid that domino effect and where you should start. It's important to prioritize and categorize your key vendors and then conduct financial reviews on those. Critical vendors obviously require a financial health review, so use that as a starting framework. From there, you can define a regular cadence at a minimum on an annual basis, and then also create templates and questionnaires that you can use for that consistent experience when performing your vendor financial reviews today and in the future. Involve different parts in your organization, as we'll discuss on the next slide, and a best practice is never to wait for regulatory guidance to dictate when you should start. It's always better to start as early as possible to, again, avoid that domino effect. As I mentioned, there are a lot of different parts of your organization that get impacted by a vendor's financial health, and ultimately it stresses the importance of these vendor financial health reviews being done in the ongoing phase, as well as obviously in the onboarding phase in certain circumstances. So start from the top. Management sets the tone at the top and ultimately defines the risk appetite that your organization wants to achieve across not only the vendor financial health reviews you conduct, but also across the rest of your third-party risk management practice. From there, you'll want to engage with subject matter experts. These can be either internal FTEs or outsourced professionals and systems that can help you. That will help do the work for you. You'll want to also engage with your accounting and finance team to help review some of the work and also define some of those key metrics that you want to track and maintain in your vendor financial health reviews. And then work with folks like operations and in your legal department to execute on and define those contractual obligations and maintain the oversight of those across your vendor base. And then your vendor management team and your specific team members to ultimately follow up and collect documentation and some of your third-party risk management workflows as it pertains to these vendors. And finally, make sure that you report up and manage the risk and compliance in congruence with what your team is doing from an overall third-party risk management program. So, like many other due diligence that you perform across your third-party risk management program, it's important to centralize and document all of your financial health processes and procedures in one tool or in one location. This can help create this consistency and can create an audit trail, which is obviously very critical for those that are in highly regulated industries that have audits or examinations. So it's always good to, at a minimum, put them in some sort of Excel file or in some sort of database or spreadsheet, and then also create templates that your team can use to add that consistency and that audit trail across all of the vendor financial health reviews that you'll be doing. With these in place, you can ultimately have a larger impact on these reviews across your organization and across those teams that we just walked through on the prior slide. And it can give you the necessary controls in place to answer questions that may arise either from your stakeholders or some sort of external party like an auditor or an examiner that is working with you to understand what you've done to assess the risk and then ultimately work to mitigate or remediate the risks that have been identified. So oftentimes many folks that are new to this practice and are new and trying to understand how to get started within performing vendor financial health reviews want to know what type of documentation to collect on vendors. And it depends on the availability of this information, but as a best practice, from a quantitative standpoint, you'll want to get, at a minimum, the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement, or any of these as a starting point, and want to get it for at least 2 or 3 years so you can perform a trended analysis. The gold standard, as I mentioned, is always try to inquire and receive audited financial statements where possible, which can be difficult for small private vendors, and we'll talk about some of the things you can do for those circumstances on some of the next slides. But you should always try to request the ideal circumstances and let the vendor provide you what they have produced or what they have access to so that you can start your quantitative reviews as it pertains to these financial health assessments and reviews you're doing. On the qualitative side, you'll want to also try to inquire to the vendor of any sort of management discussion and analysis details they have, any sort of, if they are audited, any sort of audit opinion or letter or going concern letter that shows that the business has enough liquidity and to remain viable for the next 12 to 18 months, some sort of management letter statement on their financial condition, which can either come from the first 2 bullets in that qualitative section, as well as any sort of ancillary ratings or debt ratings that they have from a credit rating agency or some sort of external third party, and perhaps any sort of capitalization table as of a point in time or an overview on their sources of capital and funding, as that can expose to you their financing sources if they need some sort of liquidity in the future or if they're an unprofitable entity that's making strategic investments to grow their top line and their revenue base. From a lot of that initial information that you'll request and receive, you'll also want to capture and calculate a variety of key ratios because these key ratios can help identify red flags on vendors when performing these vendor financial health reviews. So these are typically calculated from the combination of either the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement. but all have different impacts as to your analyses and your review process. Some key ones to be aware of are current ratio, which is a good indication of how much liquidity in short-term assets does a company have against its current liabilities. Another one is total net worth, which is the difference between a company's total assets balance on its balance sheet and its total liabilities balance on its balance sheet, which ultimately shows how much asset base they have when you remove all of their obligations to either external vendors or their internal team members as it pertains to things like payroll liabilities. On the income statement side, margins are often critical because they show how effective a business can be in generating profitability on its overall revenue base. So gross profit margin and operating income margin, as well as net income margin, are critical margin ratios that you can be aware of and use in your analyses. And then finally, going back to the balance sheet, things like leverage, which shows how much indebtedness a business has, as well as its goodwill and intangible percent of total assets, can help expose some ancillary useful metrics to help understand the quality of some of the balance sheet items and how liquid a business may be in the event of a domino effect impacting them. So as I mentioned on a few slides ago, getting information from vendors can be a mixed bag. When you're dealing with public vendors, it's as easy as looking at the Securities and Exchange Commission EDGAR website and pulling their 10Ks, their annual reports, or their 10Qs, their quarterly reports, when they're made available during a public company's filing cadence. International public companies have a similar database called CEDAR, and also make their reports available on their websites when they're public. So you can always go through those public domain resources to get the details. You can always also request financials directly from them, so keep that in mind. On the private side, it's typically a bit more challenging and a bit more of a variety across a continuum as it pertains to requesting and getting information. You'll typically only get the details when you request it or require it from the vendor, and you'll have to do a good job of trying to add some consistency in the request to get it, or adding some language within your contracts to maintain this and also have the vendor provide this as part of their contractual process. In lieu of getting information in that way, you can always go down holding calls with them or holding diligence sessions with them to try to get specific information to perform your reviews, or rely on public sources such as Dun & Bradstreet, CreditSafe, or Argos to effectively get some of those high-level details on these private vendors so that you can at least begin some of your financial health review processes and begin to mitigate or accept the risks that you've identified. So with these issues with collecting information and making sure that it's consistent across the board, you'll oftentimes run into challenges with private vendors and receiving adequate information. You should always start by still asking for the audited financial statements, but when you don't get those, you can ask for unaudited financial statements and use those accordingly in your review process. If that fails, you can always rely on asking for a Form 1120 on these corporations, if they are a corporation, which is a tax filing to the IRS that you know they have, because if they don't, they're going to be in some trouble not paying their taxes to their IRS and making sure that they're in compliance with those cadences. In addition to those challenges and what you could do, you could always ask their chief financial officer or their head of finance or even their management team to provide you a financial health letter, which speaks to certain qualitative and quantitative information that we've discussed earlier in the presentation. And if all else fails, and even if that fails, you can always rely on a third-party report, like a credit report from Dun & Bradstreet or CreditSafe or Argos, if they're available on these private vendors. You can then also ask these vendors some simple questions via email or on a telephonic presentation, or even request that you meet with them on site to just go through some of your questions as it pertains to the financial health reviews. Some examples of those questions can be, what is your revenue range? What is your liquidity and cash balance? And do you have sufficient capital to sustain operations for at least the next 15 months, which is typically also known as a going concern opinion that's present in audited reports for financials. So as we talked about the qualitative and quantitative aspects of a vendor's financial health, it's important to understand that you need to focus on their financial performance from a quantitative point of view, but also bring that together with some of the qualitative comments and look at their overall financial health. It's important to view the vendor in a holistic, comprehensive fashion and combine those quantitative details to ultimately craft your risk ratings and then be able to trigger those workflows as it pertains to the rest of your third-party risk management practices and policies and procedures. If those risk levels are manageable and are worthy of being accepted by your team based on your policies and procedures, monitor this and move on to the next vendor or workflow. You can, again, next year perform the same type of financial health assessment. If the risk levels that you've identified after your financial health reviews are too high, you should work with the vendor with some of those subsequent diligence requests or look for a new vendor based on some sort of procurement process that you'll run again or some sort of replacement to that vendor so you can find someone who can provide you a better product or service without the issues that they have from a financial health point of view. So here are some real-life examples of why financial analytics are important but don't always convey the full picture. One example was a vendor has a large revenue base, ample liquidity, and strong performance trends. But when doing the financial health reviews, you discover in their annual report that they're being sued by the Department of Justice, and there's nearly $250 million of exposure regarding that litigation. If you just focus on the financial information, you may miss that off-balance sheet liability, so it's important to dig into those footnotes and include those findings in your financial health reviews. On the flip side, another example showed a year-over-year for a vendor, year-over-year revenue decline and some other poor income statement trends, but showed an increase in liquidity from period to period. The income statement showed that the vendor was performing poorly and deteriorating in its performance, but the balance sheet and its total liquidity profile improved slightly. The income statement shows that it has a higher risk profile, but when looking and combining the balance sheet in the financial health review that you've done, you can find that the reason why that their performance was declining on the income statement was because they were divesting a non-core asset, and therefore were doing it to improve their liquidity and help improve the service levels that they have agreed to for certain customers like your organization. So again, always good to look at both that qualitative and quantitative information when you're performing your vendor financial health reviews. So here's a quick list of qualitative disclosures to look for from vendors. A going concern opinion, as I mentioned, is going to be available when you have an audited set of financial statements. Subsequent events are critical because they can show some things that have happened after an audit has been completed. And then things like uncertainties or estimates can expose any sort of material judgment that has been made when creating certain financial metrics and financial ratios shown in the company's financial profile and key statements. Other things like customer and supplier concentration, legal and litigation issues, credit risk issues, as well as any sort of breaches or disaster recovery issues can also expose more risk that has been introduced to this vendor that could ultimately lead to it having to have legal exposure and some sort of financial penalty that may not necessarily be reflected in those quantitative financial statements. So again, always important, as we saw in those other examples, to review those footnotes and review some of the qualitative information that is found in these financial statements when possible. Other key items to review include those risk factors, as I mentioned, the litigation and legal proceedings, and then the audit opinion. Again, some of this has already been provided to you all, but just to reiterate it further, these annual reports will typically have these in there. It's important not to get too caught up in these when it can be a distraction, but some of them may expose some tidbits that are helpful to utilize in your overall financial health review process. Throughout this presentation, we've talked about performing a regular cadence and defining a regular cadence on when you'll do your financial health reviews. This is important because vendor ratings can shift over time. So at a minimum, you should be doing these on an annual basis. Don't assume that the financial health of the vendor will remain the same. And as you use a regular cadence, you'll start to improve your process and create further consistency, both with the vendor and other teams that are involved in your financial health review process internally. Consider the following areas when you're looking at vendor financial health review over time: changes in scale of that vendor, changes in availability of data and data depth, changes in performance trends, and recent disclosures that a vendor has made versus what they had done in the past.
We are to the last poll question of the day, and that question is, what type of tools or systems do you currently utilize to perform and manage vendor financial reviews? Spreadsheets or in-house tools, specific software or technology, you outsource to a third-party service provider, or none of the above or none currently used? And Robin, a question has come in from the audience that I think we have some time to answer. And that question is, what if a private company refuses to provide financial statements or details?
Thank you, Jesse. That's a great question, and one we often hear from a lot of our clients and folks within the space inquiring about performing vendor financial health reviews. Typically, when you're dealing with a private vendor, it can range in the type of information and the quality of information they provide to you. Oftentimes, they may not even provide it. So in the case when they don't provide it, there are different resources available to you, and there's also different alternative paths you can go with the vendor to try to acquire at least some data for your financial health reviews. In lieu of getting anything from the vendor, you can rely on a Dun & Bradstreet credit report or a similar credit report from a different company, whether that be S&P or even CreditSafe. And those will give high-level information about a vendor's financial health profile you can then use in your reviews from a financial health point of view. If you want to actually trigger some questions back to the vendor that helps simplify some of their answers and responses to you, you can actually inquire for more specific data points and limit the amount of information that they have to provide to you. So for instance, you can ask them for their top line revenues, their profitability, and whether or not they have enough liquidity to sustain operations for the next 18 months. So there's ways around it when a private vendor doesn't want to cooperate, but that should hopefully be sufficient in trying to get enough information to for your financial health reviews. Back to you, Jesse.
And on your screen now, you will see those final results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. Before we move on, please be aware that the Importance of Vendor and Supplier Financial Performance ebook is available in the related content widget. This ebook will discuss how important financial performance for your vendor is to your organization. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Raman.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you, folks, for answering that poll. We'll transition now to just discuss some key red flags to look for as you look forward into your next year of financial health reviews. As expected, you should always look for continued declines in revenue and volume across vendors. That could indicate some sort of pressures they're facing in the market from their revenue base. You could also look for continued negative cash flow trends and liquidity issues, as those are typically a key red flag on whether or not a vendor can perform on its obligations and contracts for its clients. You should also look for any sort of lowered ratings from debt or credit rating agencies, any sort of breaches of financial and debt covenants they may have with those said debt providers, lack of profitability given that loss of revenue and inability of the business to manage its costs, and any sort of increased customer or supplier churn details as they're made available. These alone may not necessarily point to an issue, but together alongside some of the other information that you'll perform in your holistic reviews can expose some high risks that you want to be aware of, and again, try to avoid getting into the domino effect as it pertains to that vendor. Going back to the ongoing phase of that third-party risk management lifecycle graphic that we kicked the presentation off with, it's important to understand how your vendor's financial health has drastically changed or has not, and then ultimately ask yourself some of these questions in order to execute some of your downstream third-party risk management workflows. You can ask yourself if the vendor's financials are better than any other provider that you have, either currently or prospectively. Have you begun to see any sort of the domino effect with that organization based on those quantitative and qualitative measures? How quickly are you getting to a decision in your third-party risk management workflows? And whether or not you can find a similar provider for a similar service in the future. To conclude, let's go over some best practices as it pertains to your vendor financial health reviews. You want to understand that your vendor's financial health reviews may be required by regulatory bodies, but beyond that, you should be doing them as a best practice to ensure that you have a strong third-party risk management practice and avoid domino effects on these vendors. You also want to make sure that you're not always going to get an ideal set of information, so try to gather what you can and review it and not hamper the rest of your third-party risk management practice. It can also be a challenge to go through all the information, so try to use some of the best practices and line items we talked about today to tailor your reviews and make sure that you focus on both the quantitative and qualitative measures. And finally, once there is risk identified, be sure to act on it and bring in other people in your organization to help you, whether they be executing on your contractual and legal obligations or working together to identify a new set of vendors that you want to bring on to replace a high-risk vendor that you have consistently monitored.
Great. Thanks so much, Raman. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending the second day of our boot camp. I would also like to thank our experts from today, Lisa May, Hershey, and Raman, for their time in sharing some really important information on vendor stock reports, cybersecurity, business continuity management, and financial health, all of which will tie in with tomorrow's third-party risk management boot camp's third and final day. Tomorrow, we will be joined by VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Advisory, Greg Cameron, who will begin our offboarding sessions focusing on termination and exit plans execution and the third-party risk management closure. After that, we will be joined by VinMinder's Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy, Hillary Dewhurst, who will wrap it all up with reporting and preparing for exams. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Lisa, this next question is for you. What sort of follow-up would be suggested when a vendor has a qualified opinion?
That's a really great question. Definitely you want to follow up to see that the control issues that cause that qualified opinion are resolved and that there really are documented remediations. So understanding if and how your vendor addresses issues is going to be really important to helping determine the overall impact of that opinion and any correlating exceptions, if any. So another thing to consider too is how long ago the reporting period was, because depending on how soon you're doing your follow-up, you also will want to see if those control issues have been corrected and then even validated that they're working. So if you're already into that next audit period, it's a good idea to ask that vendor for evidence that those controls that were found to not work in the previous are working today.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Hershey, will come over to you for this next question, and that is, what should you be doing with BCM planning with fourth parties? What are best practices? And what, if any, are regulatory expectations for fourth-party oversight related to their planning?
That's a good question. This is a situation I was just dealing with recently. And just for transparency, when we're talking about fourth parties, we're really talking about a company your third party outsources to. So when it comes to BCM planning for fourth parties, this will depend on the inherent risk and criticality of the fourth party to your third party. So if it's a data center or a cloud service provider, for example, they would be critical to delivery of services by the third party. So they need to be reviewed as if they are a third party.
Perfect. Raman, this next question will go to you. If a vendor only agrees to provide one or two pieces of information, what should we request or focus on?
Thanks, Jesse, and thank you for putting me last on the follow-up questions list. I was just catching my breath after the last few slides. But in terms of the 1 to 2 items you should request when you're trying to tailor your requests on a financial health review basis, good to focus on revenue and profitability as possible, because that shows a company's ability to generate money and also its ability to generate a profit. And also conversely ask for their liquidity or their cash balance so that you can have comfort around their ability to sustain operations into the future, irrespective of whether or not they have any sort of profitability. So oftentimes unprofitable companies still may have enough capital to sustain operations because they're investing across their business to deliver the product or service. So if you really want to focus on the top 3 things, it would be revenue, profitability, and liquidity.
Great. Lisa, we'll come back to you for this one. Some of my vendors have several products each, some of which we use and some we don't. How do I know which SOC covers what?
That's another great question. I always say to start by focusing on the auditor's letter in section 1. That should really clearly call out what product or service is covered in the report and what was actually audited. And then, go to section 3 of the SOC report. It's going to go into a lot more detail about the product or service and also talk about scope. Sometimes reports are going to cover multiple products, and oftentimes we're seeing today that reports are covering pieces of products. So they might scope out technology controls to a technology report or an internal type subservice, or they might scope out, one aspect of the product that they're providing. So really understanding from that auditor's letter in section 1 what the product or service is, and then going into section 3 to get more details on the scope is going to be the best way to do that.
Great, thank you, Lisa. As we know, everyone's time is very valuable. We are going to pause on questions for a moment to cover some important follow-up items to be aware of to wrap up this hour. However, if you do have time or would like to stick around to hear some more answers, we will continue questions for a few more in just a moment. Don't forget, you can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources on the topics we covered today and beyond. If you'd like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session. That recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email you will receive on Friday afternoon. Also in the email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credits. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found day 2 of the bootcamp valuable. I'd also like to thank Lisa, Hershey, and Raman for their time and great content, as well as addressing questions that came in. We hope you found those answers were helpful. The questions we answer in the next few minutes, we will also follow up via email in case you can't stick around to hear the answer to your particular question. On behalf of InMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great rest of your afternoon. All right, we will now continue with a few more questions for those who have time and would like to stay on for a few extra moments. Hershey, we'll come back to you for this one. Oftentimes, vendors are unwilling to share their actual testing results due to their sensitive nature. Could you please share some advice on navigating these instances?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, that's not an uncommon practice for vendors not to want to share their business continuity and disaster or recovery and testing. We understand that they consider that confidential information, but as I said earlier, they can't just say everything's confidential. When we have our clients, we actually request summaries of test results to include items such as what was the date of the last testing, what type of testing was it? Was it tabletop, simulation, functional, or full operational? What systems and personnel were involved, and whether the test was successful or not. And if it wasn't, are the issues found during the test being remediated, or have they been remediated already?
Great, thanks so much. Raman, this next question goes to you. How do we effectively integrate our financial review process with the other aspects of our third-party risk management program?
Thank you, Jesse. Obviously, financial health reviews are just one aspect of it. For all critical vendors, you should look to conduct a financial health assessment because their performance obviously would indicate whether or not they may have other issues downstream with either business continuity, as Hershey has walked through today, and other areas like their system and operational controls that Lisa's walked through. So when you want to focus on where to start by looking at all of your critical vendors and performing a financial health assessment on them and integrating that into your program. As it pertains to involving other people, like we talked about earlier today, it's always good to incorporate a holistic view across your organization. So management voice is obviously reflected in your financial health reviews. You also get your board's voice and the governance structure's voice, and then other people like your operations team, your compliance team, your legal team, to ensure that, I know some of you have asked some questions around legal, should we make it part of our contracts? It depends, but at a minimum, I think you should involve other people so that they have a baseline understanding of how financial health impacts some of those key subject matter experts areas and points of view across your program. Back to you, Jesse.
Thanks, Raman. Lisa, this next question will go to you. Since SOC 2 Type 2 reports are pretty comprehensive today, can we use that on its own to review a vendor's cybersecurity posture?
Sure. So this is a question that we do get a lot from our clients, and the short answer is really a non-answer, which is that depends. SOC 2 reports are a great resource for initial due diligence, as well as ongoing monitoring, especially because they include externally audited controls. SOC 2s allow a selection of trust service criteria from availability, security, confidentiality, privacy, processing integrity, and even cybersecurity when we talk about SOC 2s for cybersecurity. So all of those things are part of your cybersecurity review. The question is really whether they are enough to satisfactorily review your vendor's entire control environment, and that really is going to depend on the inherent risk that's introduced by the vendor, how you use that vendor, where they fall, the maturity of your third-party management program, the maturity of that vendor. So I hesitate to say yes, you can use it across the board, but I wouldn't say no either. I think it's a piece of the puzzle, and it just really depends on how big your puzzle is and how many pieces it is. But it's always an excellent place to start. And if you can look at nothing else, if they don't have anything else, you can, generally speaking, get a lot from it, especially the SOC 2. Just full disclosure, though, to be very clear, you could not use a SOC 1 in that same manner.
Perfect. Thanks, Lisa. Raman, we'll come back to you for one more question. In an annual report that we review on a vendor, which items could we ignore?
Good question. I think we talked about this a bit in that risk factors section when you're looking at an annual review, but oftentimes when you're looking at a public company's 10K or even a 10Q, there's a lot of information there. Sometimes it looks foreign, even though it still is written in English for the native English speakers, but in so many ways, a lot of that information can be noisy. For instance, there's a lot of tables on supplemental information as it pertains to some of the income statement and balance sheet and cash flow items. So probably a good decision to ignore some of those supplemental information tables, particularly as it relates to things like depreciation and amortization or some sort of capital expenditure component or some other detail that's very technical in nature from a quantitative point of view. On the qualitative side, some things to ignore are long-form risk factor information that may be repetitive in nature and maybe goes into a level of detail that seems very canned and legalese in so many ways. You want to look at their high-level risk factors and try to see if it aligns with some of the other information you've extracted from some of the fundamental pieces of financial information and or footnotes that are particular to the management's discussion around its performance and analysis. But don't get too buried in reading every footnote or every paragraph because, again, you only have so much time in your day. I know there's some other question around how many people should you employ to do 10,000 reviews. Certainly, that if you're going into too much of this detail, you probably need a whole staff of folks and probably a whole outsourced partner to do it. So try to create a consistent deliverable and use those consistent metrics both from a qualitative and quantitative point of view to get through your financial reviews in enough detail and also to capture enough of a risk profile on that particular vendor. Hope that answers the question, Josie.
Thanks, Raman. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you to our experts for answering some more of those. On behalf of VidMinder, it has been a pleasure. We'll see you tomorrow for our third and final day of the boot camp.